93.5, 1590 WAKR. You hear that eerie music? We're going back to 1968. We're going to film school. Film study professor Joe Fortunato on board with us. One of the first movies I ever went to the theaters to see. 1968's Planet of the Apes. And let's bring him in. Joe Fortunato has the story for us. Good morning, Joe. Thanks for joining us again. Take us back to the Planet of the Apes, my friend.
Well, good morning, Ray. Good morning, everybody. And yes, we're going to visit the Planet of the Apes today, which was released on February 8th, 1968. It was directed by Franklin Schaeffer. It was written by Michael Wilson, but as I'll talk about in a moment, it was actually, a lot of it was written by Twilight Zone's Rod Serling. Stars Charlton Heston, of course, Roddy McDowall, Kim Hunter, and you played some of that very eerie, creepy music. It was nominated for Best Score by Jerry Goldsmith. He didn't win. It was also nominated for Best Costume. It did win an honorary Oscar for Outstanding Makeup, as that probably comes as no surprise. It was pretty amazing what they did to create those apes. This was really the big sci-fi franchise of the 60s and 70s before Star Wars and Star Trek revived and overtook that genre. It was so successful that it spawned, like I said, an entire franchise, several sequels, a few reboots decades later, live-action TV show, a Saturday morning cartoon, tons of merchandising with action figures and models and stuff. So it really was sort of the prototype for what Star Wars would become, almost a decade later. The movie's famous line, or one of its famous lines, is "Get your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty apes," was voted number 66 on the AFI's list out of 100 great movie quotes. It was, as I mentioned before, Rod Serling, who was, of course, the creator of The Twilight Zone, actually produced what he says was nearly 40 drafts of the screenplay. But he wasn't really able to come to grips with the structure, so he ended up giving it full credit to Michael Wilson for the final screenplay. But a lot of Rod Serling's work is in that, including the famous ending, which I don't really want to give away for those who haven't seen it, but those who know. Talking about makeup, when adjusted for inflation, this movie holds the record for the highest makeup budget, which represented about 17% of its total budget. And during the breaks in filming, I find this really interesting. During the breaks in filming, the actors that made up different ape species, like gorillas or orangutans or whatever, they would hang out together at lunch. So the gorillas with the gorillas, the orangutans with the orangutans, the chimps with the chimps. It wasn't asked for or required. It just sort of naturally happened, which I think is sort of a fascinating sociological experiment.
Joe, a couple of things I wanted to throw your way on this movie. One is, where was the film location? Obviously on some sort of ocean front. And number two, and you touched on it, I think one of the greatest endings ever when you talk about a movie, and I know it's kind of giving it away, but it is a movie from 1968, but it's one of the best endings of movies I've ever seen.
Yeah, and there were several endings that were thought up, and Charlton Heston actually liked the ending that ended up being used. And again, I'm sort of dancing on it. You're right. It's we're celebrating 55th anniversary here. But it was an iconic ending. And one of the another line, of course, from that ending is "Damn you all to hell." And they had a problem with the censors because they didn't want to use that word. And the producers and Heston says, "No, we're not saying that as an expletive. We're saying that literally as like, hey, God, damn these people to hell." So that's how they kind of got that over on the censors. You asked about the locations. Mm-hmm. It was actually filmed largely at Lake Powell, Utah. So they had some water there and some desert scenes and so on and so forth.
The other aspect that I want to ask, because this led to many other sequels to this movie, Was that planned all along, Joe, to come out of this movie and do the others? Or once they saw the success, did they just keep going?
I think it's the latter. I mean, this was kind of a risky film. Sci-fi as a genre wasn't really that popular at the time. One of the things that sort of spurred them on into making this was the success of a film called Fantastic Voyage. And we just lost the late, great Raquel Welch the other day, and she starred in Fantastic Voyage. So sort of the success of Fantastic Voyage gave them the wherewithal to take a risk on this. But I don't think there was a 5 or 6 movie plan. I think it was just the success of that. We always like to talk about casting. Charlton Heston was sort of always the producer's first choice for the part of Taylor. Marlon Brando was actually considered as a backup. Sean Connery, Steve McQueen, Paul Newman, all the big names, Burt Lancaster, James Garner, they were all considered for Taylor as well, but it was ultimately Charlton Heston's role. Now, for the role of Dr. Zaius, the sort of wise orangutan, there was considered Yul Brynner, Alec Guinness, Laurence Olivier, Orson Welles, and actually Edward G. Robinson did a screen test for it, but he didn't think at that stage of his life, he was older and not in great health. He didn't think he would be able to complete the project, so he didn't finish that. And for the role of Nova, the Heston's, I guess, girlfriend, love interest, whatever you want to call her, was Ursula Andress and Raquel Welch, which we already mentioned, and they both turned it down. And instead it went to Linda Harrison, who was the producer, Richard Zanuck's mistress at the time and then later wife. Rock Hudson was considered for the role of Cornelius, but they thought that he was too big a star and that he might overshadow Charlton Heston. Plus, they also wanted the chimps and the orangutans to be played by shorter actors, so that went to Roddy McDowall instead.
Very nice. Planet of the Apes, 1968. Joe, before I let you go, you brought up Raquel Welch, and I think it'd be very timely. Your thoughts on Raquel Welch, the movie star?
Well, it's interesting because, obviously Raquel Welch is known for her looks and being a sex symbol and then really representing the 60s in particular and to some degree the 70s. But she did make quite a few films and never was a big movie star, but she never played sort of a damsel in distress. She was always sort of a competent, tough woman, which is kind of forward thinking on the part, especially someone who looks like her. And I think she should be remembered for that.
Joe Fortunato, film study professor. Today, we went to film school on 1968's classic Planet of the Apes. Joe, great stuff as always, my friend. Thanks for being on board. We'll reconnect again next Friday.